everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to Another DNA Testing Firm is in Trouble by Steve Leto. Now, this is a channel I am slightly familiar with. I've seen his videos pop up from time to time. I do like a lot of attorney lawyer channels. I like Legal Eagle and Attorney Tom and bunch of other channels, and so I see a lot of them coming up in my feed. So when I saw this come up about a month ago, I definitely wanted to have it on my list. I got to watch it beforehand because it's talking about, you know, DNA and legal stuff. And so I thought it was interesting, so we're gonna just dive into it from here.
I've never sent my DNA into a DNA testing place. I thought about it, but the interesting thing is that my father did my family's genealogy back hundreds of years. And I know that all of my ancestors came from Finland. So I'm suspecting that my family tree doesn't involve a whole lot of other ethnic backgrounds in there. Although I've heard of people who've been surprised.
I would say that a lot of people will assume that they're largely one thing. And if you're especially coming from like an American ancestry or an Australian ancestry that dates back at least a couple of generations, you know, you're not like a first or second or third generation American, but like, you know, your great-great-grandparents or third greats or, you know, something like that, like your ancestors were immigrating in the 19th century especially, then usually there's a lot more going on than people expect. Not always.
It always kind of bothered me that other people would have that information. And so I'm sure you know that people send off their DNA to these testing companies. They get a report back and goes, here's, you know, your DNA makeup. But we've now also heard that law enforcement routinely sends requests to these companies going, can we run your database to look for criminals?
So this part was a little sloppy in the way that he talks about it. I don't know how much he researched beforehand, but that's not quite what's happening. They're not just reaching out and being like, hey, can we access it? In the beginning, when they first started having law enforcement accessing these databases, some of them were doing it without the database even knowing it. And so some of the people that were working on these cases were uploading those DNA profiles from the cases onto the websites. Now, after the Golden State Killer case came out, and I think it was 2017, a lot of stuff changed, and basically the websites that allowed uploading either went the way of saying no uploads at all from law enforcement, or they did allow law enforcement uploads in specific ways. So the two companies that allowed uploads from law enforcement are Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. The companies that have uploading available but do not allow law enforcement are Living DNA and MyHeritage. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe don't even have an upload feature. So there's no way to upload into their profile database. You have to do a DNA test through their company to get into the database. Now, what he might be referring to is that sometimes law enforcement agencies will get a warrant or subpoena to try and get information from the DNA companies, but they always fight it. And a lot of these companies actually have what they call their transparency report, where they show every single subpoena or warrant they've been issued and the final ruling on them because they fight all of them.
Wait, what? Yeah, that happens. And they've broken some high-profile cases by doing that. So a lot of people have watched that happen and go, well, even though these people didn't sign up to have their DNA put in a database to be searchable by law enforcement, I guess if they're solving crimes, that's good, right?
Now, this is an interesting thing to say, just in the sense that it is a very valid argument that has come from a lot of people, that a lot of the folks using these databases, they uploaded their DNA for the reasons of genealogy, health, or just kind of a general interest in other ways, because they do also have the traits component and stuff like that. So that is a very valid argument, because I know that a lot of people uploaded their DNA into these databases basically thinking that way. But they eventually started to roll out what they call the opt-in system. And this is what fights against the idea that, well, I didn't upload for this reason. Well, when you upload to GEDmatch, you're automatically opted out of law enforcement accessing your profile for this, and you have to opt in for it to then be included. Same thing on Family Tree DNA. If you do the DNA test, they're going to get your consent to opt in for law enforcement use, and if you don't want to, you can opt out of it. So if this is a worry for you about going into these DNA databases and law enforcement accessing it, well, it's very limited, and even on the sites where it's allowed, you can opt out of that.
Well, That's not the worst thing that could happen, though. And that's the problem. There have been several stories in the news lately about this. Jeffrey and James both sent this to me. And this came from Malwarebytes, which is a security company. And they put out a newsletter. A DNA testing company vanishes along with its customers' genetic data. See, what happens if one of these companies goes bankrupt or gets sold and purchased by somebody else? So Peter Ernst wrote this. A DNA testing company that promised clients insight into their genetic disposition has suddenly disappeared. The BBC reports it tried several methods to reach the company but failed in this effort. This is one company, but there are several. London offices were closed. Nobody answered the phone. Clients could no longer access their online records. The company's social media accounts have been not updated since 2023 at the latest. So this is a company called Atlas Biomed. Customers were only able to look at their test results online. They couldn't be downloaded. So now they're not only unable to see them, but they have no idea what's happened to the data.
Now, I will say I have no clue about Atlas Biomed. This is not a DNA company I've ever heard of, but it makes sense because it sounds like it's one of the many companies that are trying to do DNA for health services, which is something that I am not very much for. In a lot of videos, I constantly talk about how the health side of these DNA tests is one of the things that is probably the most misleading and the most scary for a lot of people, and the thing that if people truly want to get health DNA information, to go to an actual genetic counselor, a doctor who knows what they're doing. But I will say that this is a real risk that people need to understand if they do DNA testing, whether they upload to a website or actually send their DNA sample into a site to have it sequenced. If you're giving your DNA or any of your information to any sort of website, anything could happen from that website. If the company goes down, if the company gets sold, whatever may happen, the DNA data that you've given them might go somewhere that you weren't expecting. Very similar in the same way that when you give your information to any of the social media companies or give it to some company to buy something or just whatever, you don't know what they're necessarily going to do with that data, whether it's legal or illegal. So that is a very real risk that if you are thinking about doing these DNA tests, you need to consider, is that risk worth it for me to do that DNA test? But this might not be something that everybody's comfortable with, so definitely research that.
There's no evidence that the data has been misused. It's worrying to not know who now has access to that data. Now, there are several company officers who resigned, several others who are still listed as officers, but then again, you can't get a hold of anybody. So DNA testing has become so commonplace that many people have just participated without truly understanding the implications. It's always been a problem to figure out who you could trust with your genetic data. For some people, it's their cheapest chance of finding out whether they are affected by some genetic disorder. So you can find out through this kind of testing if you are prone to having some kind of genetic issue.
So this statement here is a statement from a place of just kind of trust with the DNA test, and I guess, I don't know, maybe that's not the best way to put it, but basically, I would not agree with what he's saying. These are not tests that can reliably help you in terms of health. The only tests that can reliably help you are true tests through genetic counselors. The thing with these tests, they're very limited. So when you're trying to determine if someone has a correlation to a certain disease, well, there can be thousands of variants that they might be looking at to get that. And I'm talking about in terms of the actual scientific literature. They're finding in the DNA, what are the variants in our DNA? What are the spots where the letter change here indicates a very strong correlation to breast cancer, let's say? Well, it takes thousands of those variants to figure it out. Yet when you do these DNA tests, the at-home DNA test, they're only doing like 3 or 4 variants sometimes only 1 or 2 variants. And so it gives a very, very minimal idea of things. So if you do an at-home DNA test through 23andMe or whatever for the health reasons, when you get it back and it says, well, you have a higher risk of this because you have the variants, doesn't mean you're going to have it. It just means that based on the little bit of information that they're comparing your DNA to, that you do have a higher risk. But if there's only 3 variants they're testing out of 1,000, and you have the 3 but not the other 997, well, that's a big difference. But then at the same time, let's say that you get 0 of the 3. So they say you have a low risk of having this. Well, What if you take the main test and all of a sudden you have all the 997 except for the 3 that they tested? Now, of course, those examples are a little bit on the outlier side of things, but that's really how it is that it can't be something to use viably.
But a lot of people simply do it to find out where their relatives came from. So since those early days, we've had several warnings about how submitting your genetic data can go sideways. In 2018, MyHeritage suffered a security incident which exposed the email addresses and hashed passwords of 92 million users. In 2020, Ancestry was acquired by investment firm Blackstone, which raised questions about whether or not the genetic data could be commercialized and how it affects the people who've used them in the past with the new owners.
I will say that when Blackstone bought Ancestry, I know a lot of people in the genealogy community that were not happy about that and worried about that. And in all honesty, rightly so. I think it is, a little worrying when you have a large corporation like Blackstone coming in and purchasing something like Ancestry, which is such a vital component to being able to do genealogy in present day.
And there's an ongoing saga with 23andMe. In 2023, cybercriminals put up information belonging to as many as 7 million of their customers for sale on criminal forums following a credential stuffing attack against the genomics company. Genomics? Genomics. Comes from genome, but since then, all board members have resigned except for the CEO, who has stood by her plans to take the company private, raising again the subject of what happens to customer genetic data when a company is sold. So data breaches, of course, happen to everybody, it seems, in every field out there. But this is the concern because it's not just your username and password, but it's your actual genetic information.
And that is definitely the thing that makes this unique beyond all the other stuff. And I know I say it a lot in a lot of my videos about, you give information to any site, you go on Facebook, you go on Twitter, you go whatever information you give them, even just buying something on a website. Sometimes you have to give information that if that were to get out in some way, you wouldn't be happy about it. So you have to trust in those sites. And then also there's the hacking and all that. But what makes this unique is it is your genetic code. But one thing I often say is that, when it comes to the DNA, in all honesty, it's not that hard to get your DNA. If someone really wanted to get your DNA, all they have to do is follow you and wait for you to put down a spoon or spit or throw out a cigarette or something like that. And they go and get that and then try to sequence your DNA.
A UK regulator has confirmed it's received a complaint about Atlas Biomed saying people have the right to expect that organizations will handle their personal information securely and responsibly. Unfortunately, we know that not all organizations will meet that expectation, so there are a few things you should keep in mind. If you submit genetic material, research the company you want to trust with it thoroughly. Only share the personal information you absolutely have to provide with the genetic testing company, and lie if you must, and create a separate free email account so the information can't be tied to your main account. Yes, that's a UK regulator advising you to lie if you must. Make sure to familiarize yourself with the company's privacy policy and opt out of sharing information where possible. Make sure to stay informed about any policy updates or changes from the company. So the author here says, as a wise lady and one of my former editors once wrote, many a friend and family members have scoffed my warnings to stay away from consumer DNA testing kits, remarking that they have nothing to hide or that there's no harm in releasing their DNA in the hands of researchers. I honestly hope they are right. So I hope they never have to fear having their health insurance ripped away because of pre-existing conditions or an increased risk of developing certain diseases.
Now, this is something that in present day, you really don't have to worry that much about because there are laws already that protect you with this. In the US, we have what's known as the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And it's nicknamed GINA, and it basically just means that you can't use DNA to discriminate against people in various ways. So your insurance company cannot discriminate against you based on your DNA showing you might have pre-existing conditions. So they can't just take away your insurance or raise your rates because of that. And there's a lot of laws around the world that do this. In the EU, they have the GDPR, which actually protects with genetic data. So there are limitations to this. Now, could these laws be taken away at some point? Certainly, it's same thing with any country. We never know what could happen with the law. But in the present moment, there are already laws protecting people on this.
And of course, I hope they aren't inundated with marketing emails about cancer preventative nutrition or the best new medicines to prolong the onset of Alzheimer's. And she gives other examples of this. But the point is that those are all possibilities. So you are just curious about your background, your ancestry. You submit your DNA to one of these websites. They test it, and now they've got your DNA profile. And they send you back this cute little pie chart that says you're 87% this, 13% this, 4% this. Joking. And you're looking at that going, oh, that's fun. And you toss it aside and don't think about it again.
Very cute of him to think that's all that people are doing with these DNA tests when it comes to the ancestry part. And this is probably just a fact that for most people, they really don't realize the true power of these tests and how DNA matches are used to actually figure out family. And it's much more than a cute little pie chart. I know he mentioned at one point, people finding where their relatives came from and things like that, but this really has real world uses for people that are adopted and, of course, law enforcement, things like that, but people trying to find their family. So it's much more than the pie chart. And unfortunately, that's why a lot of people do it, is because they're trying to get that admixture percentage. But this is unfortunately a sentiment that especially a lot of people that are anti-DNA testing will have. And it's largely due to a very limited view of what these DNA tests can do, because a lot of them just don't even realize it or know that that's a capability. Unfortunately, this is actually a really common sentiment I hear from a lot of people when they talk about anti-DNA tests, is they really try to downplay the relatives and ancestry side of it and really just, oh, well, it's just a
percentage of your ancestry from here and there, and that's it, and throw it away and whatever.
No, it's a lot more than that. Now, I will concede that the large majority of people doing the DNA test probably aren't like me and looking at the genealogy and family relatives and all of that, but it still is a very large percentage of people.
Meanwhile, your genetic profile is sitting there in a database someplace, which, as I've noted before, in some instances, the police might search it. Now, again, you might go, I have nothing to hide. But let's suppose there's a genetic marker indicating that you might have some rare disease. Somebody might contact the company and go, can you give us names and addresses of everybody who's got this one genetic marker? We want to send marketing information to them. You might go, but Steve, that'll tip me off the fact I've got a rare disease. It might. But some people out there like their privacy. I'm one of them. I enjoy my privacy. So that's one of the reasons I've hesitated to do this. And I've now, after seeing all these different problems with all these different companies, I've decided I'm not going to submit my DNA. If anybody's going to run my DNA, it's going to be the cops. Just kidding. So Peter Ernst wrote that, and James and Jeffrey both sent it. And the interesting thing is, when I saw the headline, DNA testing company vanishes along with its customers' genetic data, I thought to myself, I wonder which one it is. Because I've heard of several different of these companies being in the news lately. Several of them. And I had never heard of this one, because this one is apparently primarily based over in Europe.
And it's also one of the smallest companies, I'm guessing. I mean, I've never heard of it, and I'm in the DNA testing world, but on the genealogy side, so maybe it's bigger on the medical side, but there's a lot of third-party DNA companies out there, and when it comes to the bigger companies, I feel like I have a lot more comfort. There's a lot of third-party companies where I'm like, I have no interest in uploading to this because the tools they have don't help me at all, so it's just not worth the risk for me. And so kind of same thing with everything going on here. If some of this DNA stuff is not worth the risk for you, don't do it. But this company he's talking about, I've never heard of them before this video.
So it's happening over there. I don't know if those databases were ever searched by law enforcement. But then again, in Europe, the Bill of Rights is not really a thing yet.
Yeah, they have GDPR.
Yet. Joking again. So James Jeffrey, thanks for sending that. Questions and comments, put them below.
Okay, now this video I was a little disappointed by, and honestly, it felt kind of thrown together. It seemed like there was a lot of information that was missing that just a little bit of searching possibly could have uncovered. I mean, for one, not talking about Gina and him being a lawyer. I would think talking about the actual laws out there and learning, what is the law available and what protects this. So that kind of surprised me. He didn't even touch on that. And then also just kind of not really talking about the true use that law enforcement has. And this is something that a lot of people get wrong, but it's something that's just really, really annoying because it's this constant piece of misinformation of, law enforcement can access your DNA. And it's like, well, yes and no. They can access some databases. They can't access all databases. And the few databases where they can access it, it's limited based on what the user chooses. So that's really where a lot of the disappointment comes in, is just from a lot of the nuance that's just completely left out. That I think that's why I feel like it's just thrown together. Like it was like he saw the headline, kind of did a quick research, put some notes together, sounded good. Okay, let's go. But unfortunately, because of that, this is pushing a lot of misinformation that, for people who are anti-DNA tests, I don't think they're really going to be that care that much about it. But for me, especially as someone who does DNA testing, who's very much about DNA testing and pro DNA testing, it's something that it's like I'm constantly fighting against, because I do truly believe, as I've said in this video, people need to understand the risks associated with it so that they can make an informed decision. But people aren't going to be able to make an informed decision if all of the information they have is coming from misinformation. Now, with all of that said, I definitely think that he made some really good points. There are some points that I've actually never really heard many people making before, especially that last one that I didn't really comment on, where he was talking about how a company might approach one of these DNA companies and say, we're looking for all of your users who have a high risk of this pre-existing condition so we can market to them. And while a lot of the terms of service and the privacy statements that these companies have basically say we aren't going to do that, they could change that stuff at any time. But unfortunately, overall, this video just didn't really feel like it was informing as much as just kind of like talking about all of these various things where the connection is DNA and it's not very strong connections. So hopefully my video helped clarify some things for some people, especially for people that maybe were a bit confused about what was going on, and especially kind of the statements in terms of law enforcement accessing these databases and which ones they can and can't. And if you enjoyed this reaction and you'd like to see more reactions of mine, be sure to check out this video right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.